Federal Drive is presented by GEHA, Government Employees Health Association, proudly providing health and dental benefits to federal employees and their families. Visit GEHA.com.
Welcome back to the Federal Drive with Terry Gerton on Federal News Network. Over the past 2 decades, the military services have transitioned away from their organic equipment maintenance capabilities to buying sustainment from the original equipment manufacturers. It seems that approach may be resulting in less readiness, not more, and Secretary Hegseth has said he wants to bring repair capabilities back in-house. But is DoD ready for that? Here with more insight is the director of the Center for Defense Information at the Project on Government Oversight, Greg Williams. Mr. Williams, thank you for joining me.
I'm glad to be here.
You've got a new assessment coming out from POGO that looks at the right to repair. We'll get into the specifics of that in a government application, but first tell me more about what it is and maybe give us a couple of commercial examples.
Sure. So the right to repair is simply an end user's or an owner's rights and sometimes tools and equipment necessary to maintain their own equipment. And there are things like your cell phone or an Apple Watch that are sort of known for being things that you can't open up and take it apart and fix yourself. You have to go back to the original manufacturer for that. And maybe a more amusing example is the notorious ice cream machines at McDonald's, which for years were often not available. And as it turns out, that was due to an arrangement between Microsoft and the ice cream machine provider that required them to perform all the repairs. So those machines would break, as any machine does, and it could take a long time for them to be repaired. In the meantime, the people who ran the store couldn't sell ice cream, couldn't repair the machines themselves.
Yep, nobody got soft serve. But how does that now translate to one of the biggest equipment owners on the planet, the Department of Defense?
Well, I think that's an excellent point. I think a fundamental difference between an end user of a cell phone or an owner of a farm tractor is that in that relationship, you have one individual or small company that's going up against usually a much larger company. In the context of military right to repair, you've got one of the largest institutions on earth, the Defense Department, somehow acting as though it's weak and it doesn't have any power relative to a much, much smaller company that may be making that truck, rifle, naval vessel, or aircraft. And so why the government gives up its market power in these cases as often as it does is mysterious to us.
So how did DoD get to this point?
Well, I think part of it is simply being convinced that this is the way that the commercial market does things. When you buy a piece of equipment nowadays, very often it comes with a warranty or a service contract. A good example is General Electric when they sell aircraft engines to Boeing or Airbus, or indeed an airline or an aircraft leasing company. They sell it on a basis of what's referred to as power by the hour. You get a certain number of thousands of pounds of thrust for a certain number of hours, and you pay a fixed amount for that. And in exchange for that, GE does all the engine maintenance. So, we're always looking for ways to take advantage of the profit motive and commercial techniques, and I think that's led us down a path that often makes sense in the civilian world, but makes a lot less sense in the military context.
In the early 2000s, there was a push toward life cycle sustainment as part of the acquisition contract. Is that part of what's happening here?
That is certainly, that's an example of saying, look, in the private sector, we can pay one price, either on a monthly or an annual basis, and not only get the thing that we want, but make sure that it's working at all times.
Is this limited in the Department of Defense to like super high-tech pieces of equipment, or is it kind of across the board?
It's across the board. It applies to everything from trucks and rifles and diesel generators all the way on up to naval vessels.
So what's the impact? How does it play out on a day-to-day basis? Is it affecting DoD readiness?
It is. I mean, we hear case after case of naval vessels either not being able to operate it to their full capabilities or needing to stay in port because they're waiting for contractors to come out and conduct maintenance. We actually had an incident last year where a Navy destroyer almost collided with the ship that was refueling it because they had repeatedly had to wait for the contractor to come out and fix a steering problem, which they never in fact fixed before that near miss incident.
I'm speaking with Greg Williams. He's the director of the Center for Defense Information at the Project on Government Oversight. So this makes me ask, a ship overhaul, for example, used to be programmed for 18 to 24 months. Now it's taking much longer for the Navy to get their ships in and out of the overhaul process. Is part of that happening because of the loss of the right to repair?
I imagine so, but I think that's a more complicated set of issues that has to do with not only with the balance of repairs that are done underway or by Navy personnel themselves versus overhauls, but it also has to do with a general decline in our shipbuilding industry and a struggle to maintain the employees and the skills and facilities needed to perform those overhauls.
This issue has risen to the level of the Secretary of Defense. Secretary Hegseth has made some comments and issued some memos around this. What are you seeing as positive movement?
Well, I think that it's great that he's spoken very strongly about the need for right to repair in the context of the Army. We're very eager to see either him extend that guidance to all of the services and or Congress to act to ensconce that guidance in law.
And is there movement on Congress to do that?
So we know that Senator Warren continues to be a strong proponent of this. We're looking forward to her reintroducing her Service Member Right to Repair Act in some form this year. So we're optimistic that we'll see movement on this in this legislative year.
So what other policy recommendations or programmatic changes does POGO recommend related to reinstating the right to repair?
So I think it's important not only to be able to have access to the parts, manuals, tools, et cetera, and the rights. It's important not to be constrained by warranty agreements or other legal agreements that prohibit the military from doing things for which it is equipped and skilled. But on top of that, it's really important that we be able to get those parts and materials at a reasonable cost. So in addition to the intellectual property necessary to acquire those parts, we would love to be able to offer those parts out for competitive bids so that instead of relying on the original equipment manufacturer or one of their designees, we might be able to produce it in-house or offer it out for bid for multiple contractors.
Well, the military has an extensive depot maintenance system. Would you argue that they ought to be taking more of these responsibilities into the depot system, both for manufacturing of the parts and doing the overhauls?
Yeah, that is a key element of readiness. I mean, you think about how much maintenance is required during peacetime. Imagine how much that's increased during wartime when we're going to have not only wear and tear, but battle damage to repair. And if these depots don't have the practice to make these repairs and do this maintenance, we're not going to be able to do that as quickly as we need to.
So what about the cost trade-offs there? It seems like it would require significant infrastructure investment to rebuild this kind of capability inside the Defense Department since we've outsourced it for so long. Are they considering that kind of cost and investment?
So I think one of the important things, at least in last year's version of that Service Member Right to Repair Act, is that it requires that those costs be considered up front in the acquisition plan for major systems. And it also places renewed emphasis on what are called sustainment reviews, which are statutorily required reports that each branch of the armed forces is required to do every 5 years for each individual system. But by and large has not been doing in many cases, and in many other cases it's simply not making available to the public. So we're requiring them by law to make these studies and to see what the cost trade-offs are, and they're either not doing them, they're doing them late, or they're not making them available to policymakers.
So it's one thing to talk about the investment in infrastructure and supply chain, but it seems to me there's a third leg of investment, and that would be in service member training. I mean, every service has extensive maintenance capability, or at least units that are supposed to perform maintenance. Would the service members who are maintainers need to undergo additional training? And if so, how would that be incorporated into DoD's strategy?
So this is, again, something that we wish we knew more about on the basis of these sustainment reviews and acquisition strategies. Presumably, it would require some additional training, but we don't have a comprehensive view into the the total inventory of skills, which ones would need to be trained on more personnel, which ones already exist, which ones involve servicemen and women sitting around already trained, not having the opportunity to practice what they've been trained to do.
So we're really, it sounds like, just at the beginning of this conversation, raising the issue, but yet to take full account of the costs and the trade-offs that we need to consider to move more of this maintenance in-house.
Well, that's right, although I think it's worth mentioning that we used to do a lot more of this, and we've spent a lot of the last 20 years decommissioning various maintenance facilities and reducing the amount of training provided to military personnel for these types of duties. And so while it's really important for us to have current plans, current approaches, and current measurements of the efficiency of all of these practices, we have decades and decades of experience on which to draw.
Well, I'm a former Army maintenance officer, so this issue is near and dear to my heart. I appreciate POGO raising it for broader conversation.
It's been my pleasure.
Greg Williams is the director of the Center for Defense Information at the Project on Government Oversight. Thank you so much for joining me.
Thanks for having me.
We'll post this interview at federalnewsnetwork.com/Federal Drive. Subscribe to the Federal Drive wherever you get your podcasts.